Did Israel defy the president? And is the president continuing to not understand the parties he's dealing with? I'll put it that way.
Not understand and certainly not be able to control. The collapse of the ceasefire yesterday after 2 months in which it more or less had held was really a striking sign that the American diplomatic effort has essentially failed to resolve the terms or bring anything like a real peace agreement. It's fascinating to see that Israel is chafing against President Trump almost as much as Iran is. Israelis were furious when President Trump, in effect, ordered them not to continue operations in Lebanon, which is nominally the trigger for Israel's strikes from Iran. The language that President Trump used with our colleague Ed Luce from the Financial Times, I call the shots. Netanyahu doesn't call the shots. It was an assertion that it's Donald Trump who's in control. The events yesterday showed how far that is from true, that Trump is observing these events, cannot control them. The efforts he's made, increasingly strenuous, to bring an end to this conflict don't seem to be working. And we're back in a tit-for-tat, missiles fired on Israel, missiles fired on Iran situation this morning. Somehow, I'm sure diplomats will try to put this back together. We'll have a new round of attempted talks. But the distance between Trump and Netanyahu today is one of the most striking factors of the conflict.
And we have seen this now a few times, Caddy, where there has been a flare-up of violence. The ceasefire seems threatened, and President Trump is so desperate to not resume full-fledged hostilities, finds a way to walk it back, to say, well, can keep pushing forward, even as there really aren't much in the way of negotiations going on. He wants this war to end. He doesn't want it to spark up again. But this was the most egregious violation yet, and also so striking, as David laid out there. Israel strikes Lebanon, Iran hits back. President Trump tells Netanyahu, no, do not respond. And they do anyway. Now, on one hand, if you're Israel, you feel like you have to. You cannot let an attack from Iran to the homeland go unanswered. That would be an extraordinary sign of weakness. They could not let that occur. But at the same time, that's Netanyahu, first of all, attacking Lebanon in the first place, which starts this new cycle of violence, but also defying Trump, despite Trump couldn't have been more clear that he didn't want this. And in fact, he just came on Truth Social again a few minutes ago saying he's ordering both Israel and Iran to stop. Well, right now, neither of those countries are listening to him.
Yeah, I mean, by my count, I think we're in the fourth or fifth iteration of Trump saying we've almost got a deal, and then something getting in the way of that, getting back to tensions, not necessarily outright hostilities, but clearly not at the point where we've got a deal. And David Ignatius, one of the striking things about this is that in this attack, Iran seems to have changed the kind of chessboard, if you like, because now we are in a position where the American president, because of American gas prices, is shielding Iran effectively from an Israeli retaliation. We did see them strike, but not perhaps in the way that Israel was planning to. I mean, that's a dramatic shift. I'm just thinking we're in one of those if Barack Obama moments had done that moment. Can you imagine what the outcry would have been?
I've never seen this level of tension between the United States and Israel about Israel's basic ability, prerogative to defend itself. Trump said Israel should not retaliate, should not operate against Lebanon any further. He seems to have taken deep interest in Lebanon's ability to try to defend itself. So we are in this situation where the ability of the American president to control Iran and the IRGC obviously limited to close to zero, but also the ability to control our closest ally, Israel, also limited. So I think it's a period adding to the frustration we see in Donald Trump's face in every interview, certainly in the one we're going to talk about with NBC's Kristen Welker. He's a man who's under enormous pressure right now.
So President Trump, in his interview with Meet the Press, was pressed about his 2024 campaign promise that he would not start new wars. Take a listen.
First of all, I didn't guarantee no war. Why would I have built the strongest military in the world? I built our military. I inherited a terrible military. We had no equipment. We had nothing. I built a tremendous military. Biden gave a lot of it away, but it's still a relatively small portion compared to what I built.
But you said it over and over again, Mr.
Why would I
President?
build a military? Now, I didn't want to use this, but I'm doing you and everybody else a big favor. In the midst of the greatest stock market in history, in the midst of the most successful country, because as you know, in the last term, we were a dead country, Kristen. I know you're a big liberal or a big progressive.
No,
but
I'm just a journalist.
We were a dead country. A year ago, a couple of years ago, we were a dead country. Now we have the hottest country anywhere in the world. And at the all-time hottest point, which is probably now, believe it or not, we just had all brand new stock market records today. But at the hottest point in the history of our country, I took Scott, Howard, I took Pete, I took everybody into a room. I said, I have to do this country, this world, the Middle East, Israel, everybody a favor.
Okay, so Kristen Welker is right. The president said it several times, including in his victory speech, as highlighted by a video The Bulwark posted on social media. Take a look.
You insisted no new wars.
First of all, I didn't guarantee no war.
I'm not going to start a war. I'm going to stop wars. No more wars, no more disruptions. We will have prosperity and we will have peace. Under Trump, we will have no more wars, no more disruptions, and we will have prosperity and peace for all. I am the candidate of peace.
All right, John Howman, so let's get to the politics of this. Voters were with Trump to an extent. Many were, despite his lies about election, threats of retribution, let alone talking about mass deportations and going after the worst of the worst. And now look what's happening. Most people who are being held in detention and deported are not the worst of the worst. Affordability, he calls a joke. And as you heard, he promised no new wars. He promised not to engage in wars around the world. He definitely heard from advisors that it would not be prudent to attack Iran. Many have said exactly what would happen is happening right now. So I'm wondering, will voters still be with him when gas prices are sky high and we're engaged in this complicated, seemingly potential forever war with Iran?
Well, Mika, I mean, look, well, all we can gauge right now is from what we've seen in polling, right? And what we've seen in the election results from the start of Trump 2.0. What are those things we're seeing? We're seeing a president who quite clearly built his political brand and his political reelection campaign in 2024 around a couple of very ironclad things, one of which was, I'm going to bring prices down, and the other of which was, I'm not going to start any more wars. The idea of Trump as the candidate who was against forever wars, against long-term entanglements of the United States in places around the world, that's 10 years of Donald Trump, not just in 2024, but going all the way back to when he started running for president in 2015. So for the president, you know, to make the claims he was making to Kristen Welker yesterday, as if to say, well, I would, you know, anti-war candidate, me, is ludicrous, and that you could have found the same kinds of language. In fact, in his second inaugural, where he said many of the same things there that he said in his victory speech that the Bulwark found the other night. So that is one thing that no voter across the spectrum believes that Trump was ever for getting into a bunch of more long-running entanglements, as I said a second ago. And then the second thing, of course, is the prices issue, which is connected to the war in Iran. We're now looking at a situation where there is no end in sight to this war. And even if the war were to end tomorrow, which is not going to, there's no one in the world of international economics who thinks that the aftershocks to the core prices that we're facing around inflation, not just with gas prices, but food prices and other things, isn't going to take many, many months to get worked out of the system. So the answer is, to your question, is right now the president's at a historically low place in his approval rating. He has lost ground with independents to a dramatic degree. He's seen some erosion among even the most core of his base. And it's why we are looking at an outlook in November. No one can predict the future, but there's not a credible election model around right now that doesn't show the Republicans losing the House of Representatives and with the Senate very much in play. And it doesn't look, and this is something I keep coming back to, I'm a broken record on this. We're now past Memorial Day. In the world of American elections, most of the factors that determine how elections, both presidential elections, but particularly midterm elections, get locked in this far in advance. It's very hard to change the trajectory of the electoral outcome this close in. It doesn't seem that close to a lot of people, but the Congress is more or less out of business now. The members of Congress are not going to start focusing on their reelections. There is not going to be major legislative action between now and November. When we have the midterm vote. So a lot of this stuff is locked in. And again, you can't predict the future. Anything can happen, yada, yada, yada. But right now, the trajectory for Donald Trump politically is terrible. And nothing that's happening in Iran on the ground right now forebodes anything better for him and his party.